Hi and welcome. I'm Nomi Prins. I'm here today with Jake Halpern, the author of the fascinating and horrifying new book, Bad Paper, Chasing Debt from Wall Street to the Underworld. Jake, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. This book is incredible, and so is your story. And I think the two really mirror each other. This takes place in Buffalo, New York, a lot of it. And you're from there, aren't you?
Yeah, that's right. I grew up there. My dad and his wife still live there. I go back there fairly often, and it's kind of how I find my way into this world.
You talk about a particular and many unsavory characters that are scrabbling to make their own piece of the world and often have prison records and have been drug dealers and so forth. There's a fellow named Jimmy that comes out here that seems to be one of the main characters of this nonfiction story.
Right.
Can you talk to me a little bit about how you connected with him?
Yeah, so the way this got started was, I was talking to my mom a few years back, and she told me she was being hounded by a debt collector. And she said, I don't owe the money that he's saying I owe, but I think I'm going to pay him just so he'll stop harassing me, which my mom is like no lilting Willie. So I thought, this is kind of bizarre. And I started Googling it and saw that there was a lot of this kind of going on, and that actually the epicenter of debt collections in general in the United States was Buffalo, or was one of the big hubs. So I had in my head that I was going to do a story actually from the collector's perspective, and what's it like to collect debt, what are the challenges you face, what's your life like. So I pitched the story to the New Yorker, just kind of bare bones, saying like, what do you think about this? I'm from Buffalo, I could probably get someone to talk to me. And my editor said, great, 5,000 words, when can you get me a copy? So I kind of panicked because I had nothing. So I went to Buffalo once and no one would talk to me basically. And I went a second time and I still had nothing. And so I started to panic because I was on the hook for this story. So I went on Facebook and I just sent messages to everyone I went to high school with, and then everyone my brother went to high school with. And I get one message back from this guy, who was actually Jimmy's brother, and I got Jimmy on the phone, and Jimmy said to me basically, you better get down here quick if you want to talk to me, because my business is struggling. I don't know how much longer I'll be open, but if you can like show folks how hard my day-to-day life is, I will be satisfied. So I popped down to Buffalo, showed up, and Jimmy just was immediately one of these amazing characters. It was just eloquent and emotive, and I'm driving around in this car with him, going to church with him and meeting his family, and that becomes kind of my entry point into this world.
And he had a struggle. You knew him growing up as well. You got to him through a set of correspondences through Facebook and so forth. Tell me a little about your history in Buffalo and just the atmosphere in Buffalo, how it's changed from what you knew growing up and in your childhood to the kind of place that it's one of the capitals, right, of debt collection in the United States. How did that?
Yeah, so I mean, Buffalo was once this big industrial powerhouse. It had all these steel mills and all this industry, and starting in the late 70s and early 80s, basically when I was a kid, that all starts to fall apart, and unemployment goes through the roof, and in place of a lot of these old industrial jobs, collections kind of fills that void. Someone told me that Buffalo is so good at collections because even though the country has been in a great recession since 2008, Buffalo's been in it since 1979, and people there, you know, can connect with people who are having hard times. So when I was kind of a teenager even, this was starting to kind of take form. But I don't think I really knew about it. And even though I went to high school with Jimmy, we went to the same high school, and it was supposed to be an integrated high school, we came from opposite sides of Main Street, and Buffalo is a fairly segregated city. And I didn't have any sense of what life on the east side of Buffalo was like, or what Jimmy was going through. And even though we could talk about having the same English teacher, it was like we were from totally different worlds. And it wasn't until I started reporting the story that all of a sudden I learned that when he was in high school, his father was a heroin addict, that after getting out of high school, he had become a cocaine dealer, had gone to jail on a gun possession, and you know, our lives couldn't have kind of been more divergent.
So he, you said, is the entry point into the rest of the story, and he, of course, has a very interesting component of this story through something that you call the package,
right?
Which seems to be the crux of what you're chasing and what the debt collectors are effectively chasing and involved in the book. Can you kind of talk about his relationship, what the package is,
right,
and how that opened up the rest of this amazing story to you.
So yeah, so the package is this one piece of debt that I follow through the book, and it's, I think, helpful to understand that when I talk about debt that's being bought and sold here, we're really just talking about an Excel spreadsheet. So you have the big banks or creditors, and they try for, say, 6 months to collect on a debt that's not been paid. And when they can't, they'll typically sell it off for pennies on a dollar to debt buyers. And those debt buyers will collect whatever they can, then sell to the next and the next and the next. And what they're selling is just, as I said, a spreadsheet with the bare bones information.
What's the information on customers, on their balances, on their where they live? What kind of information?
So like you look at the spreadsheet, it will have debtor's name, social security number, address, balance, date that the account was opened, maybe 1 or 2 other fields, but that's basically about it. And they're just being bought and sold and emailed or sent by thumb drives. And that is the paper. They call it paper, but that's really all that it is. And as you can imagine, it doesn't take much for something to go wrong, for some of the fields to get mixed up, the amounts, the debtors' names to get confused, or for someone to sell the same Excel spreadsheet to multiple unsuspecting buyers who are all collecting on it at once. So in my book, I follow the package, and what I call the package, this one piece of debt. It's about $48 million in its face value, but which is bought for pennies on the dollar by this debt buyer in Buffalo. His name is Aaron Siegel. And what happens is this piece of debt gets stolen. Somehow, Aaron finds out from his collectors. They start calling him and saying, Aaron, something weird is going on with these accounts. It appears that somebody else has access to this information and is collecting the money from the debtors on this package before we get to them. So at that point, he calls his fixer, who is a guy named Brandon Wilson, who's a kind of his unofficial partner, who's a former bank robber, who's kind of gotten into this business, helps him buy and sell debt, but also helps him solve these sorts of problems. And it's Brandon who then goes and tracks down the thieves that have gotten a hold of this debt and retrieves it. And we can talk about, it's a crazy showdown with guns and they get it back. But the world in which he must go to retrieve that debt, that's the world that Jimmy inhabits, which is this kind of gray area of legality, kind of underworld of buying and selling debts in kind of sketchy manner that exists in Buffalo and in other places.
Right. And this underworld has that hierarchy you mentioned. And there you have sort of former thugs, to a large extent, at the bottom level, getting some of this paper that is perhaps been sold and resold. And you also talk about how paper's been stolen as well. And then you have sort of the level up through Aaron Siegel. And he seemed really an interesting character to me. I'd like you to kind of talk about how you got to him through Jimmy and also through the package. And also, he wasn't a thug. He grew up on the good side of Buffalo, right? He had a wealthy family upbringing, lived in a mansion.
Right.
So how did he come into the same business?
Right. So the story really the way that I tell the story in the book, it starts with this guy, Aaron Siegel. And Aaron grew up in a wealthy and very well-known and well-respected family in Buffalo. He goes to Wall Street for a while as a banker. He even does some time in London and decides he wants to come home and be closer to his family. And he ends up working at an office of Bank of America in Buffalo. But around the time that he comes back, what's happening is that throughout Buffalo, entrepreneurs are buying some debt, or they're buying this paper, these spreadsheets, and then opening up a shop where they hire a bunch of collectors to collect on it. And the profit margins, this is right before the kind of Great Recession happens, his profit margins initially when he gets into this business are through the roof. He's like buying a portfolio of debt for 30 grand and in 3 months making 90 grand. So he realizes that he's kind of found this amazing little niche of the finance world. And his supply, the key to much of his success is he's got this supplier who's supplying him with this paper at a really great price, and it's really lucrative. The weird thing about the supplier is he's this fellow, Brandon Wilson, who's this former armed robber who's done 10 years in prison, but has reinvented himself as a debt broker who's got this kind of genius for finding paper that pays, that is very collectible and isn't that expensive to buy. And so even though Aaron kind of comes from this very kind of more rarefied world and has got this kind of banking past, he understands that in this sector of the economy, it's not unusual to have some kind of shadier connections or some guys that are rough around the edges. And so he and Brandon form this kind of unlikely friendship and partnership. And that's really the starting point for the book and for the story.
And you talk